Thank you guys for joining me. Welcome into the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiegue. I have a lot of stuff to talk about on today's episode, starting with the Tennessee Titans and the speculation and topic around their number 7 pick, what it's looking like right now that they're going to draft, and how it could be a bit closer than a lot of people think. Later on in the show, I'm going to talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach, Doug Peterson, and what he would like to see more out of his team in 2024 to make sure they take that next step and not have such a drastic fall off like they did last season, as well as talking more in detail about the Stefon Diggs trade, more on the Bills side of things, why they ended up trading him, and all the factors that led into such a big move at this point in the offseason. So a lot to talk about today. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast on both the GSMC Sports Network channel and the GSMC Podcast Network channel, as well as on all the social media platforms. Before I get into segment 1, I want to remind you guys, if you want to get involved with the show, ask me questions or leave any comments during this live show, to please use the tip and donations link, which is gsmcpodcast.net. With any of your questions and comments, using that link, make sure your question pops up right away in my chat box. I can read it on air and answer your questions or comments. It makes it more fun. It's a big help for this show as well as all the other shows. If you guys are able to do that with the link, again, gsmcpodcast.net, we always appreciate it greatly whenever you guys are able to do that. And saying that, I will jump into that first segment like I mentioned. The Tennessee Titans picking number 7, not the most overhyped or really talked about pick in the top 10. It's all been around the top 5, top 4, pick 6, and then what's going to happen after that. Really, the Falcons and the Titans get no attention because those seem like the most obvious picks in reality in the top 10. The Falcons have to go defense. Every mock draft you see or that I've seen has them taking Dallas Turner, the edge rusher from Alabama, and it makes sense. They desperately need a pass rusher. I've said it on this show. So that one is probably the most obvious pick in this top 10. And then the Titans are all but set. It seems they're drafting Joe Alt. It seems like that's the consensus. That's what everyone is getting out of Tennessee. And with some reasoning behind that, obviously, because their general manager, Joe Carthen, has said that their main focus is offensive line as well as wide receiver. And that's where I wanted to go with this whole conversation around the Tennessee Titans. Every mock draft has been Joe Alt, Joe Alt, Joe Alt, and more Joe Alt to the Tennessee Titans at number 7. But wide receiver is a real possibility here. Just listening to head coach Brian Callahan and their general manager Rand Carthen, both have stressed offensive line is important, that no one's arguing that, but wide receiver also is, depending on how you value it, how you see it, scoring points now is more important than ever in any point in NFL history with how talented everybody is, all the quarterbacks the good teams have. You have to be able to put up points. And that's what Brian Callahan, their new head coach, was kind of going when he's commented on this back at the NFL Combine. Back then, when they asked him about it, he said, "You can never replace elite talent. The better players you have, the better coach you are. I will never pass up on elite talent just because we have a great coach. A great coach with elite talent is special." He said that back at the Combine. And just further on in that sentiment, to talk more specifically about wide receivers, he said, "When all things are equal, guys that can score touchdowns tend to make more of an impact." In the simplest of forms and terms, yes, that makes sense. It's all subjective on how your team's made up, on how who your quarterback is. He must think of Will Levis pretty highly to mention, putting up points and just surrounding him with all of these weapons that he has. It makes the decision easier, I guess, later on when you're deciding on Will Levis. If he has a bad year, you can't really blame it on the rest of the team because they have Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, and if they do indeed draft the receiver at number 7, then there's really no excuse for the poor performances on offense. Regardless of offensive line struggles, lucky for the Titans, the two main focuses for them this year, wide receiver and O-line, those are probably the two deepest positions in this year's draft. Everyone talks about Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison, Rome Odunze, but there's a lot of talent that can be found in the later rounds. Thomas Bryan Jr. from LSU, Malachi Corley is another one from Western Kentucky, a great prospect, has gotten a lot of attention at his pro day. He performed very well. And then offensive tackles, there's a ton, but talking about offensive tackles and O-line, those are more likely to go earlier just because everybody knows how important it is. And it all, again, depends on if they fit for the team, if the team really likes that prospect. They'll move up and go get him by any means. But usually when nobody moves, there's no drafts made, if people have to settle on someone, they're going to draft an O-lineman. So that's kind of where it stands right now. The Titans have a great opportunity to draft the presumed best one in Joe Alt. He's been the number one ranked offensive tackle this whole time. But then there's also other ones that you can get in the later rounds if they decide to trade back. Or, like I talked about yesterday with Jim Harbaugh and the Los Angeles Chargers, he stressed greatly that the offensive line is something that probably he views as the most important piece of his entire scheme, game plan, evolution of this Chargers offense, and he's picking at number 5. So I brought up the idea of if they take Joe Alt at number 5, where does this leave Brian Callahan and the Tennessee Titans? Are they going to pivot just and move on to a wide receiver, or are they going to trade back, depending on how it all plays out? It's really the biggest wait and see game right now. It's 2 weeks before the NFL draft. It's always reacting to stuff that happens. Once someone makes a move, you can get a clearer picture of how everything pans out. But it's interesting to think about this situation that the Titans find themselves in right now between offensive line and wide receiver, because Brian Callahan witnessed a similar situation back when he was with the Cincinnati Bengals back in 2021, when the discussion was all around, do we get offensive line help for Joe Burrow to protect Joe Burrow coming off a major injury, or do we get the wide receiver that has great chemistry with him, is a game changer, one of the best receivers in the NFL draft, in Jamar Chase? Do we go get him or protect Joe Burrow? They decided to go with Jamar Chase instead of Penei Sewell in that draft, and obviously in hindsight now, it's looking like a genius move by the Bengals, because now their offensive line, they've addressed it, and they still have Jamar Chase, and they made it to a Super Bowl right after really making that pick. So it looks great now, but it's funny to see how that has kind of swung around now with Brian Callahan in Tennessee. Now, it is a little bit different because most likely he's not going to have one of the top 3 receivers at 7 and Joe Alt sitting there. So that's the biggest difference, but there are some similarities there. And seeing how it all plays out with the Chargers, mostly if they trade back and a team like the Broncos or the Raiders move up there, then they're really going to have a shot at Joe Alt, because the Giants most likely won't try and draft him. Then they're up at that point. They might lose out on a wide receiver, but they could still get the offensive tackle. It's a lot of moving pieces right now, a lot of ifs and buts with this whole situation with the Chargers and the Titans specifically. If they go Joe Alt and say the Chargers get a wide receiver and then they get Joe Alt, is that the smartest move for the Tennessee Titans team? That I've said I've been a fan of what they've done this offseason. I've liked the additions of Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins. But if you have Joe Alt sitting there and you still sit at 7, would it be so crazy to think that you can move back and trade out of there? If, again, it all depends. If they love Joe Alt, if he's their number 1 player, go ahead and draft him. But I have to think that they're planning not to have Joe Alt, because the Chargers are very high on offensive line. I know they're receiving trade calls, but it's still a possibility. They have to have other prospects to be their number 1 guy if Joe Alt's not there. Same with wide receivers. Wide receivers are more likely to be gone. So would it be the worst idea now if the Titans trade back a little bit, and with you could think maybe the Broncos, the Raiders, maybe somebody else in the mid rounds to move up and try and get a wide receiver or another position that they have high value on. That hasn't been reported or anything like that, but that's the biggest thing right now. If you have the ball in your court and you have Joe Alt sitting there, do you accumulate more draft capital as an effect to try and build up the rest of this roster? Because they're not really a finished product. They're getting there. They still need a few more pieces. I would like to see them add more on defense. They got L'Jarius Sneed. Their secondary is still not really much more other than that. They got Awuzie, which is great. They have one very good corner, one of the top ones, and then Awuzie is very decent. He's not bad, but you could definitely get better there, and he is on the, I think he's 30 or on the other side of 30, so that's another thing. Safety could be an issue that they address. Pass rushers, or edge rushers, I should say. That is all the situations right now going through my head, and I think it's not so cut and dry with the Tennessee Titans and figuring out, oh, they're just going to go tackle and that's it. They're just going to move on after that. Brian Callahan is stressing, bringing a more aggressive, spread, offensive, scoring mindset to this Tennessee Titans team. It's something people might not be used to, but it's definitely a good thing, in my opinion, to see this out of the Titans, to try and modernize their offense a bit more. I think it's going to benefit them a lot because they just got Stefon Diggs in their division, so they're definitely going to have to put up points to try and compete with the Houston Texans. And on that, I'll leave that conversation there. In the meantime, we'll transition. I'm going to have a lot more time to talk about Stefon Diggs later in the show. But for now, we're going to go to the first break of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. And on the other side, we're going to talk more about my predictions and my options available to the back-end teams picking in the bottom 10 of the first round in the NFL Draft, what holes they need to fill in their roster, and what options are out there when they're selecting in the back end of the first round. A lot more on top of that. Don't go anywhere. A lot more to come on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. On this second segment of the show, I'm going to be analyzing the late first round picks that we have in this year's NFL Draft. Everybody is talking about the top 10. What are the Chargers going to do? What are the Giants thinking of? Who's going to move into the number 3 for the Patriots? Are the Bears actually going to take Caleb Williams? That one's more of a guarantee. What are the Commanders going to do? Everything coming out right now is about the top 10, where in the bottom half of the draft, or in the bottom 10 picks of the NFL Draft, in that first round is where you find a lot of very pro-ready, more, in some cases, more significant picks to some of these teams that are already established. And if they can hit in a late round pick with whatever pick they have, it just makes them so much better. It elevates them to another level. And that's what I wanted to shine some light on here today. Looking back at the bottom 10 picks in the past NFL drafts, You have the Bills last year drafting Kincaid, Minnesota Vikings drafting Jordan Addison. The Baltimore Ravens found probably their number one receiver in Zay Flowers. All of those were just last year. On the Ravens, Lamar Jackson was drafted with the last pick of the first round. A lot of great players are found in these picks. TJ Watt's another one. Being a Steelers fan, I almost forgot him. He was drafted 27, I want to say, just off the top of my head. A lot of great players are drafted there that are really some hidden gems that don't get the spotlight early on, but turns out to be one of the more significant picks in the drafts overall. So I've highlighted the bottom 10. I'm going to go over what they need and some potential players that could be available for them at those picks. I'm going to start with 32, the Kansas City Chiefs. They have a few roster holes to fill, wide receiver being the most notable one, offensive tackle, and defensive back with losing L'Jarius Sneed. They've addressed wide receiver a bit more with Marquise Brown coming over. They have to figure out where everything stands with the Rashee Rice situation right now. I won't get into it, obviously, just because there's no determinant facts on any punishment or anything like that, but that's going on deciding how that all figures in with the NFL. So wide receiver is still positioned, probably their weakest position last year where they were lacking. Now they've addressed it a little bit, but that could be something else. I mentioned offensive line just because they lost their starting left tackle, Donovan Smith, in free agency, and Nick Allegretti as well. He signed with the Washington Commanders. So offensive line starters and depth could be another thing they look at. Some options for them. I mentioned a really long time ago, Xavier Worthy impressed everybody with his 40. He could be there. Keon Coleman from Florida State to bring him a sort of different look that they've had at wide receiver. He's a bigger framed guy, a bigger wide receiver, a high point wide receiver that can go get you one of those catches. He's another option. Tyler Guyton, the offensive tackle from Oklahoma, isn't really projected as one of the top guys that's blown everybody away with his pro day or was already predicted to be a top guy. He's a very good prospect from Oklahoma State, or Oklahoma, I should say. He's also projected to be around these parts, so one of those guys could still be there. I expect the Chiefs to attack one of these positions and address it with the 32nd overall pick. Again, they don't really need many holes to fill, so that's a team to look out for. Then at 31, you have the 49ers. Wide receiver, same thing with them. Offensive line and safety, another defensive back. Because really they only have Travarius Ward and Amador Lenore there. They're good. Travarius Ward is very good. But again, other than those two guys, you don't really have too much. Hufanga is their starting safety, and he's still recovering from I think it was a pec injury with him. So he's still recovering from that. You could add more depth there. Offensive tackle as well. O-line for them. Trent Williams is getting up there in age. I mentioned just depth at that position is never really a bad thing for them. And wide receiver, just because of the whole situation with Brandon Ayuk. Is he going to sign? Are they going to trade him at the NFL draft or in the days, weeks leading up to it? It's getting very close, so that's something else to monitor. After, especially Stefon Diggs got traded, could Brandon Ayuk be next? Juwan Jennings is scheduled to be a free agent next year, so he's also another one that could be gone. A very big player for them, a very good underrated receiver for them. So some options for them could be Jalen Polk, the wide receiver from Washington, Amarius Mims, the offensive tackle from Georgia. Not too many starts for Amarius Mims. He's more of a raw product at this point. Not too many starts in college, and he suffered with injuries. So that could push him towards the back end of the first round, and the 49ers really aren't in a rush to find an offensive line starter. This could be an ideal situation for him to learn behind one of the best tackles in NFL history in Trent Williams, develop a little bit more, solve those injury issues a little bit by having at least practice experience and some game experience potentially not being the starter. I think this could be a good situation for Amarius Mims, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody else took him, but there is some speculation there with Mims, and the 49ers have some options there. The Baltimore Ravens, similarly, offensive line's probably their best bet. I've talked about them losing 3 starters. They've addressed one of the spots at offensive tackle by signing a player in the free agent period. But other than that, I still think O-line has to be close to, or as close to perfect as they can get, or as close as high caliber, one of the best in the league, because you have to try and get the best out of Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson. If you have holes on that offensive line, Derrick Henry's not fitting through many skinny holes or getting through barely any cracks in that offensive line or any further push from them to get him some space. He's a big back, so they're going to need some serious maulers, some serious body movers to fill those holes on the offensive line. And edge rusher is another one for them because they lost Jadeveon Clowney. They re-signed Kyle Van Noy, but he's a little bit older. So losing Clowney, how many sacks he produced for you? I think between him and Van Noy, they produced about close to 20 or over 20 sacks for them. So that's a big contribution from Clowney. He went over to Carolina. So that's something else that they can monitor, but definitely O-line. If they have one of their best prospects there, I would definitely go with offensive line for the Ravens. Moving on to the Detroit Lions, they're looking more at secondary, wide receiver, and edge as well. Jared Verse is a good prospect that has sort of trailed off a little bit more towards the back end of the first round. Cooper DeJean is another one, the cornerback from Iowa. I think in the next few days, on the 8th, if I remember correctly, he's supposed to have a private workout for NFL scouts because he was dealing with an injury that now he's recovered from. So, because he wasn't able to participate at the Combine or the Iowa Pro Day, he's going to have his own workout for scouts. He was one of the highly impressive prospects at corner. I feel a lot of people are going to gravitate towards him and watch how he is moving, how his fluidity is, and how his just mechanics are after an injury like that. He could be one that could slip because of that injury, and the Lions, I'm sure, would love to have him because of the situation with Sutton and them releasing him. They traded for Carlton Davis, but they definitely need more there. They definitely need some safety help. Tyler Nubin is a name that could be interesting for them if he falls there. The best safety in this draft class, in my opinion, would be very well placed for them. They lost C.J. Gardner-Johnson, so they have some holes to fill in the secondary. And wide receiver, I don't think is the biggest need. If I were to rank it, that would definitely be last. They lost Josh Reynolds, but I don't think they need another number one high-end receiver there because I do expect the deal to be hashed out with Amon-Ra St. Brown. So they could wait till the second round or later rounds to address that. Moving on to the Bills, it's really all about the wide receiver at this point. Stefon Diggs is gone. They have Matt Collins, Khalil Shakir, and Curtis Samuel as their wide receivers. It's not really going to cut it if we're being honest. So A.D. Mitchell is a name that's out there. Xavier Worthy. They are picking earlier than the Chiefs and the Niners, and really all the teams I mentioned for wide receiver. So they have really first picks at that. Thomas Bryant Jr. from LSU could be one that falls to them in the 20s. I like all those guys. You can't go wrong with any of those guys, and really those guys would bring a whole different level of talent that is currently on the Bills roster. So that has to be the issue addressed, and don't be surprised if they also trade up if they really like one of these receivers as well. Brandon Beam's not shy about being aggressive and trying to win. He's already said this isn't a tank year or nothing like that. They're still going to try and win. Look out for them to possibly make a trade as well to move up a few spots. Next is the Arizona Cardinals. A lot of moves and a lot of holes to fill in this roster to make it very competitive. But the biggest ones, in my opinion, are defensive back and edge rusher. Chop Robinson is a name that comes to mind. Latu from UCLA is another one. He's getting some more praise in the earlier part of the first round. So Chop Robinson is one that's kind of fallen out recently in all the mock drafts that I've seen, and him kind of not trending down, but just moving back a few spots. They need a lot, like I mentioned, to build up this competitive roster, but they're going to address wide receiver at number 4. I expect them to. So that's one thing at least crossed off. Now addressing the other side of the ball makes sense to make this a more balanced first round where you're addressing both sides of the ball. Jonathan Gannon is a defensive-minded guy, so I wouldn't be surprised if he has to address or feels the need to address the defense in the first round. Then, to round it off here a little bit, getting close to the end, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they just signed Randy Gregory. It doesn't cross off edge rusher off their list, but it does make it a little bit better to explore defensive backs a bit more. Some prospects, players that could be in this range for them could be Gabriel Murphy, edge rusher from UCLA, Kool-Aid McKinstry, one of the highly rated defensive backs heading into the college season. He's dropped off a little bit. He didn't participate at the combine, or he injured himself at the combine. Did a little bit better at his pro day, but even still, I think Terrion Arnold, Quinyon Mitchell are the top rated guys in this draft, and they're probably a lock to go before 20 or before 18. So I think Kool-Aid McKinstry will slide most likely into the 20s, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's here if Todd Bowles and the Bucs really like him and add his level of talent to this secondary. They lost Shaquille Barrett to the Dolphins. Yaya Diaby looked really nice, but they still need more depth there. Edge, again, wouldn't surprise me to address something on the defensive side of the ball. After getting the majority of their free agents back on offense, I think they'll look to defense in the first round. 25, you have the Green Bay Packers. They lost John Runyon, so offensive line could be something that could interest them. Linebacker is another one, but I don't really have much first-round grades in linebacker right now, so that one, again, is a bit touchy. I wouldn't be surprised if they took a linebacker. You always see some suspect names in the end of the first round, so wouldn't surprise me, but I wouldn't go there. Safety is another one. I mentioned Tyler Nubin. They picked before the Lions, so they could steal him there. Would be a great duo to have with Xavier McKinney. They also lost David Bakhtiari, like I mentioned, so losing 2 pieces on the offensive line. I know Bakhtiari didn't play at all, really, but he is a quality player when he was there. They could address O-line. Tyler Guyton, again, is another name. Because they picked earlier, he could be a steal for them at 25. Then the final 2 picks in this bottom 10 of the first round, we have the Dallas Cowboys. A lot of things to figure out there. Hopefully they sign somebody in free agency, but if they wait till the NFL draft, they have O-line to figure out, running backs, another one, and linebacker. Offensive line is always in need. All of these teams could go offensive line except maybe like 3 of them. The Cowboys definitely need it because they lost Tyron Smith. Biotish also went to the Washington Commanders. So that's another name that could be interesting for them. Amarius Mims, Tyler Guyton, like I mentioned, those guys are going to be hot commodities in the bottom 10 of this draft. So look out for them to make a move there. Running back and linebacker, like I mentioned, decreasing market value, so I don't expect them to address it here in reality. And the last pick, the Minnesota Vikings, to round out this top 10, bottom 10, defensive back and defensive tackle. Dwayne Carter from Duke is an intriguing name to watch there in the middle of the defensive line. Or Ennis Rakestraw, the defensive back from Missouri. 2 not talked about 2 highly graded prospects, but with the Vikings, on offense, it seems like they've addressed everything with Aaron Jones, Justin Jefferson still there, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson. I know they need a quarterback, and they might not even be picking at 23 if they trade up and get their franchise quarterback. That's not the worst option, but if they choose to do nothing and keep it at 23, I expect them to address defensive back at 11 or defensive tackle, and then do vice versa at this pick in 23. Because they traded with the Texans to get this pick, they've got more draft capital, but they could be missing the most pivotal part of the whole team in quarterback. They're just going to have to measure out their options and what's out there on the market. But that's what is my top 10 needs for the bottom 10 of the NFL draft. some good prospects out there. I mentioned a lot of names because those are the biggest names that could be left out of the top 20 and could be steals for these bottom 10 teams to improve their teams when a lot of people might not be paying attention too much to these players and how important they could be to some of these win now ready teams right away in this next season. So let me know what you guys think. If you guys agreed with some of those, did I miss out on another sleeper player that you're very high on? Leave it all down in the comments or in the chat box as well if you're watching. But in the meantime, I will be moving on with the show. A lot more to cover on today's episode. We're going to be talking about Doug Peterson and the Jacksonville Jaguars next. Then later on in the show, more on the Stefon Diggs trade and breaking down what it means for the Buffalo Bills now going forward into their future. So don't move. A lot more topics and discussion coming up right after this.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to talk more around two intriguing topics here in the NFL development. Before I get into the Jacksonville Jaguars and what their coach, Doug Peterson, said into next season, hoping that he gets out of them, one more time on today's show, if you have any questions or comments for me during the live show, use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, with any of those. Using the tip and donations link, I'm able to see your question pop up on air. I can read whatever you say on air, answer a question, or react to a comment. It makes it more engaging, more connected with you guys watching, and it's a big help for this show. Again, the tip and donations link is gsmcpodcast.net. We always greatly appreciate it whenever you guys are able to do that with any of your questions or comments. But like I mentioned, Doug Peterson and the Jacksonville Jaguars, probably the most impressive team to start off last season. At one point, they were one of the hottest teams to start. Like I mentioned, they looked like everything was clicking for this young team. Doug Peterson finally had them understanding his scheme. They were executing it very well. Their best players looked very good, like Travis Etienne, Trevor Lawrence. Calvin Ridley, again, was there with them. They were the number 2 seed at one point, and even the number 1 seed as well. When they beat the Texans in November to end November, They were 8-3, and they had a 98% chance to make the playoffs at that point. And then, if you didn't watch football at all, you wouldn't know. But if you even watched a sliver of the NFL towards the end of the season and kind of had an idea what was going on, the Jacksonville Jaguars really just crashed and had one of the biggest meltdowns, really, in recent history, just from what I remember. Looking at that number, 98% chance to make the playoffs, and they didn't make the playoffs. In their last 6 games, they lost 5 of them. They struggled with injuries and just really getting the running game going, which is the biggest thing that Doug Peterson pointed out. The running game, and trying to get really specifically Tank Bigsby more involved. And it makes sense just because of what I mentioned, Travis Etienne. He started off very impressive, very good running attack to start the game. Everything was working off of that. We saw Etienne have success early on. He had 7 touchdowns in his first 7 weeks, averaging over 4.5 yards per carry. Then that went down, and you saw all the numbers to end it. They were 24th in the NFL in yards per game, 30th in yards per attempt. They had the 13th best scoring offense, which is impressive, but it was mostly through the pass because their passing attack was ranked in the top 10. There's no sign of the rushing attack, even of how impressive they started the year. It really fell off. As I mentioned, they finished in the bottom 10 in all categories rushing. So that's something that can't happen with Doug Peterson, the kind of coach that he is, the kind of success that he's had. You look back to his teams, the last team he had with the Philadelphia Eagles that won the Super Bowl, the two running backs that he had, LeGarrette Blount and Jay Ajayi, absolute monsters and workhorses. And I mentioned both of them because that's sort of the thing that he wants to get going here with Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby. On the topic of the running attack and improving that, Doug Peterson said, "We have to get Tank going. Bottom line, he's too good. He is too good. That's why we drafted him. I think early he had some, what is that type of plays, but for whatever reason, right or wrong, biggest thing to try and take burden off of Etienne. That's the biggest thing for them right now. And you saw at some point Trevor Lawrence was looking like the kind of prospect, the kind of player that was drafted number 1 overall, of how highly they talked about him. It was good to see the passing attack going. They really supported him with, like I mentioned, Calvin Ridley. Christian Kirk was a good downfield option. Evan Ingram started to become more of a reliable weapon for Trevor Lawrence. And then you go out, draft his college teammate, Travis Etienne. It looks good right now last season. Then the overuse of Travis Etienne really got the best of them. They couldn't develop any sort of chemistry, any sort of traction, momentum to build up in those last couple games where they lost a few of them. They lost leads. They couldn't really establish their offense if everyone's just dropping back, not knowing or anticipating that you're not going to run the ball or very efficiently at that. It takes a lot of the pressure off of the defense. That it takes out some of the guessing that they have to do. Stuffing the box when they have a dangerous runner really makes it obviously easier for the wide receivers. There's less people down the field, less double coverage, less zone coverage. It opens it up a lot more than maybe a lot of people realize. Doug Peterson acknowledges that, and now he has to try to get the best out of Tank Bigsby. He was an exciting player. He had some moments that were very impressive, had some solid runs, executed them very nicely, but other than that, I think he was just lost a little bit. And with a 17-week season and how it's all new for a rookie running back, when you're behind a guy like Travis Etienne who's exploding in the first couple weeks, you can understand not getting complacent because, I don't want to assume that he just didn't give or wasn't anticipating giving his best in some of the plays that he did play, but it is hard to acknowledge that, accept that role, and then still produce out there when you're not playing regularly. That's something else that I think Doug Peterson and the Jaguars would know and acknowledge that, hey, we have to do a better job of that, getting him going early like he said, spotting him some touches here or there, making sure he's in a groove, as well as including Travis Etienne as well. Etienne suffered with injuries towards the end of the year. You don't want to see more of that. So it all points right to Tank Bigsby and getting him more involved. People saw how good this offense could be. We saw a good sample size of what this could be, how impressive they were. They beat the Kansas City Chiefs, I want to say, in one of their early runs when they were on that 8-3 win-to-loss record to start the year. That's a good thing to have on your schedule, on your resume for that year, per se. It's all very impressive, but you saw the good and the bad of a young team, not really too much experience in going to the playoffs, going to sustain a long period of success over the regular season. A lot of times when you see with these younger teams, it's more of a sprint and not a marathon. They get out to a very hot start like the Jaguars do, and then they die off a little bit, whereas the good teams, like the Chiefs, start off with some questionable losses. They lose at home to the Lions, they lose to the Jaguars, and then they end up winning the Super Bowl, right? So it all has to be played out, calculated, methodical to some extent, in figuring out the dynamics of this season and getting all your best players to play to the best of their abilities. That's really what the message is here with Doug Peterson. And having that 1-2 punch is critical for any team. Not really having the 1-2 punch, but having a just solid running game. If you have one back that could do that the whole game, and the backup running back gets 5 carries the whole game or less or a little bit more, that's fine. It works for you. If that's something your lead back is able to hold up and withstand for all the weeks of the regular season, that's fine. But some teams need that 1-2 punch, need or have the talent available to go out and give 10 carries to this guy, give another 12 to the other running back, and that way it's just a lot fresher and it works for them in their scheme. It's not something I'm not saying the Jaguars should do or they have to do. Maybe they figure out Tank Bigsby isn't that running back and they can rely more on Travis Etienne. They have to try it out and see. Doug Peterson emphasized that they don't really not know what they have in Tank Bigsby, but they didn't use him as much as he would have wanted. You look at other teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris. As bad as that offense was in all the statistical categories and passing and scoring and everything like that, they had a 10-7 record. They made the playoffs. Obviously, it caught up to them in the playoffs when all the teams are very good. But you can see how having 2 running backs, 2 solid to above average running backs, can change the whole dynamic of this team. With other struggles elsewhere, it covers up a lot if you're able to control the game, play it at your pace, and then just live off of that. The Jaguars might not have one of the best defenses to complement a running game and keep the scores low, but that's something they have to address. On offense, it looks like they have everything they need compared to last season. They've only lost Calvin Ridley, and I don't say that lightly. He was their best receiver, so that's something they have to address, but to me, it's more about the defense and trying to address more holes on that defense than the one thing you need on offense. They have the quarterback. They have a good running game, like I mentioned. That can cover up not having a top 5, top 10, top 12 receiver. If you have 2 really good running backs, they address the offensive line as well, bringing in Mitch Morse from the Buffalo Bills, signing him to a 2-year deal. So I like the way that they're going. But I do agree with Doug Peterson. This running attack needs to get better because if Trevor Lawrence is also throwing it the whole time, he could get injured like he did last year, trying to do too much, trying to be the hero a lot, and will end up missing time, and that's good for nobody in Jacksonville. So they want to make it back to the playoffs. They had an electric win, if you remember the last time they were in it, against the Los Angeles Chargers, where they had that kind of win, that kind of comeback victory. So that's something they want to get to. I don't think Doug Peterson's a problem. They've come a long way from where they were with Urban Meyer, so they're on the right path. They just need to figure out all the struggles that come with having a young team. But anyway, we're going to leave it there, and in the meantime, we're going to move on to the last segment. There's one more to talk about after this last break. More on the Stefon Diggs trade and how it affects the Buffalo Bills going forward. Good and bad, definitely, after this trade. So don't go anywhere. One more topic to cover on here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Getting back on here to the show on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, we're going to talk more about the Stefon Diggs trade because it really shook up the whole landscape of the NFL. I talked more about it yesterday on how it affects the Texans and how really they're up there, in my opinion, now with the Kansas City Chiefs and seeing them in terms of talent and in terms of just star quarterback, the coaching, it looks a lot more comparable than all the other teams do to them at this point. So it's just catapulted the Texans up to a whole another dimension. If they're ready for that, we're going to have to see it all play out. The Chiefs have the experience on their side, but it's looking great right now for the Texans. And I didn't really talk too much about the Buffalo Bills, how it all affects them, why they decided it was a good chance to trade Stefon Diggs. We're going to start with the financial side of things. By trading Diggs right now in this year, the Bills still have to take up the entirety of his remaining signing bonus this year. That's $31 million in dead cap money, the highest for any wide receiver contract currently right now. So they have to still see that out. And on top of that, you also had the rumors and just constant talk about Stefon Diggs not being settled in with the Bills, kind of losing confidence in the direction that they were going. And there was always just seems to be some sort of friction there. You saw the outbursts on the sideline with Josh Allen or by himself. It always just seemed to be something there that was just really ruffling the feathers to everything going on. Last season, around this point, mandatory minicamp was going on for the Bills, and Sean McDermott excused Stefon Diggs. He decided to do that for reasons that he might have. People speculate, and they assumed there was some friction there. It all seemed to kind of settle itself over the course of the season. But again, it all rose up again in the offseason. There were trade talks earlier this year, and now it all finally comes into fruition. And you're looking at this Buffalo team now and how it all works out. I mentioned the financial side of things and how it all worked out and how that was a reason, an incentive to trade him. The Bills, from the reports I've read on The Athletic from Diana Rossini and among others, the Bills thought that this could be the last solid chance that they have at dealing Stefon Diggs with a decent return. Diggs is now 30 years old. He's only going to get, obviously he's going to get older, but his production is going to start to decline even more. We've seen it decline a little bit over the last year and a half with the Buffalo Bills, in part because I think they've realized that they kind of have to change their strategy a little bit going forward, and he'll be completely off of their books in 2025, and they're going to have that additional second-round pick that they just got in this trade. Instead of waiting around, not wanting to trade him because he is still Stefon Diggs, he has that relationship with Josh Allen. If they kept him around for one more year, not only would he have been older, say he plays really bad, hopefully he doesn't get another injury, but if that were to happen also, they have to take his cap hit again, and his trade value, any value you can get for him, decreases significantly next year. If anybody even wants him next year for the asking price that the Bills might want, then if they would have released also Von Miller, there also talks about him and how he's also getting to that stage with Stefon Diggs, getting a little bit older, not really producing like he did in his first year. It is the possibility that they could release him. And with just releasing or trading Stefon Diggs next year, they would have over $22 million in dead money next year if they traded him or released him next year. And then they'd have to wait another year in 2026 to then get him off their books. They saw the opportunity to do it a bit earlier now, as well as with the Von Miller thing that I mentioned, also getting to that same range with Stefon Diggs. And if they were to move on from Von Miller next year, by getting them both off of their books next year, the team would have almost saved about $36 million in 2025 in that cap space that they will have. They were already projected to be under the cap, plus all of that extra money that they're going to have. The biggest goal that I read or have been reading in the news and the sources that have come out with this is that the Bills wanted to go into 2025 with a lot cleaner looking salary cap situation than they had this year. Call it whatever you want this year, a rebuild, a reshape. I'm going to call it a realignment year. I haven't heard that one yet, so that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it more of a realignment year, getting your ducks in order. They had to sacrifice definitely this year for salary cap reasons. Jordan Poyer's gone, Tre'Davious White's gone. Now Stefon Diggs is gone. Gabe Davis is gone. The kind of contract that he wanted, the Bills weren't going to be able to afford that. So it's not a reshape or a rebuild because you still have Josh Allen, one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. So in reality, you still have that chance. And if they would have kept Stefon Diggs anyway, they still would have needed a wide receiver. I don't think having Stefon Diggs satisfies them in any way that their offense is just going to turn it on again with him just another year removed, older now. They were still going to need a wide receiver anyway. And instead of waiting a year and then trying to get him off the books the following year, they saw an opportunity to do it earlier to try and realign everything for 2025 and still have Josh Allen a year younger and trying to have more time to figure out this wide receiver situation. Also, the draft class being a lot deeper this year adds on to the incentive to potentially find another number one wide receiver in the latter half of the first round. So really, there's a lot of pretty good points that you can make for trading Stefon Diggs. The biggest thing, seeing the trade go down, you're thinking, oh my God, how could they get rid of Stefon Diggs? What are they going to do? They don't have anybody on their roster. I mentioned who they have right now. It doesn't compare to the level of talent other teams have, but the Bills are just thinking more long-term now with this pick. They're going to have a chance with Josh Allen anyway. So I think looking at it now, looking more into it, it does make sense to some point. Stefon Diggs, now talking about him a little bit more. I mentioned he was 30, and I don't want to say that, it's done for him. He's just going to become average now. Last year, after November, the Diggs targets and average yards per game dropped, but that's when you saw the shift in identity that I pointed out to just a few seconds ago. They made that change from Ken Dorsey to Joe Brady. Before that, Stefon Diggs was having a pretty decent season, was putting up some pretty impressive numbers, and at one point, I forgot what it was, but he had a consecutive game streak of putting up over 100 yards. I think it was 5 games. Yeah, 5 games of 100 yards prior to the coaching change. So then you see that coaching change, and they start running the ball more with James Cook playing off at the tight ends, a lot more play action. Josh isn't putting it in harm's way a lot more than he has before. So that all plays into it, and I think then, unfortunately for Stefon Diggs, he did suffer because of that. He could have gotten more unsettled because of that. I don't want to say that his targets went down and he wasn't involved, so he's just going to throw, have a bad attitude about it. We don't know that for sure, but it is a fact that his production dropped after that. Whether it correlates, you can't really make that decision or estimation right now, but it is where it is right now. They could be shifting into that new identity, so this, again, just adds another reason why they could feel very well about moving on from Stefon Diggs if he just doesn't fit that mold for them. Brandon Beane, one of the guys that everybody wants to talk about, spoke about it yesterday in his response to the trade. He said that these moves are never easy, very hard, not made overnight. Anytime you make a move like this, as I said, very difficult. You're doing it. You're trying to win. Sometimes people might not see that. This by no means the Bills are giving up or trying to take a step back or anything like that. Stefon Diggs was about to begin his 4-year, $70 million deal. Before, to add on to that financial side of things, the trade right away saves them $27 million in 2025. So that's the biggest thing with that, and how Josh Allen reacted to all of this. Brandon Beane said that he mentioned he did talk to Josh Allen prior to both having regular conversations anyway. They haven't spoken since the trade went down at the time that I wrote down all the notes for this. But he emphasized he didn't want to blindside Josh Allen with anything. In his words, he said, "I did alert him. There had been some inquiries about it, and it wasn't 100% off of the table to trade Stefon Diggs." That was mentioned to Josh, so I think that's good for a general manager to do that. But then, looking deeper into it now, reading more about this situation, sources close to the situation around this whole trade said that the Texans presented the Bills with an offer on Tuesday, which started a 24-hour or a little bit more and some change period of internal discussions. It even involved ownership and bringing them in and what they thought all about it. Ultimately, like everybody knows, the Bills agreed to it on Wednesday morning, and that's when Brandon Beane called Stefon Diggs to tell him about the trade. That's kind of how it all went down with them. And I mentioned the financial side of things and why there are some very solid, legitimate points as to why this made sense. But now you look at the Bills, big picture, they have the 28th pick now. Very likely candidate to trade up. You acknowledge that. But again, it's a deep class. So do you want to do that? Do you just feel comfortable with accepting that if you go in the second round and get a wide receiver, he might not be the starter that you need and you just have to go with that? That's an option. Brandon Beane mentioned free agency is not over. There are solid players they could add. Tyler Boyd jumps to mind right away. Odell, whatever he has left in the tank that he can give you is an option. But regardless of that, it was always going to be hard to keep Stefon Diggs because of all the noise and the constant questions and topics being brought up to Beane, Josh Allen, and Stefon Diggs. I think now it got to the point where this was a good compensation for the Bills, that they just felt it was the time to move on from him. Not that they wanted to move on from him, but looking at it big picture, money and everything like that, it made the most sense for them. I'm sure Stefon Diggs understood that. He had a very heartfelt message to the organization right after it all went down. And if it all goes bad, say it all comes really bad and they have a very poor record and Josh doesn't look as he usually does that throw into the conversation of a Sean McDermott or somebody being let go because of how bad it looks? Is that fair if it goes that way, knowing that it is a reset, realignment year, like I mentioned before? That's a question I'm sure that will be posed at some point in the season if it all does go really extremely bad. But I don't think it will solidify into anything very serious. Sean McDermott has proven himself, I think, with that organization enough for them to know that nobody's in a great position this year, so everyone's jobs are pretty much on the safer side. But the biggest question and thing to talk about with this whole situation, and I'll close with this, is that, we saw Patrick Mahomes lose Tyreek Hill. At some point, Aaron Rodgers lost Davante Adams. Now, Josh Allen loses Stefon Diggs. Lamar Jackson's really never had a wide receiver to the caliber of a Tyreek Hill or a Davante Adams. Justin Herbert just lost all of his targets and how people talk about him. This is a situation now with Josh Allen that people will state it, he doesn't have Stefon Diggs. That could be a reason for the drop-off, but I don't think a lot of people will feel sorry for him or will really use that as an excuse for much longer or for very long, because comparing him to Patrick Mahomes all this time, seeing him as a top 3, top 2 quarterback, and putting him in that conversation, Patrick Mahomes has been in this situation and he's gone on and won 2 Super Bowls without Tyreek Hill. So Josh Allen has been in this conversation. This is the situation you want to be in, obviously, being compared to the best and being in those conversations. But at some point now, he has an opportunity. It doesn't look great, but it is an opportunity to go out and show people that with this lack of talent, I am still that guy, and I can still go out there and take this organization to new heights and produce, even if I don't have the pieces around me like the other great quarterbacks have gone and done. And if he doesn't do that, people already don't give him enough credit to my estimation. So if he does do that, I'm sure people will jump on him. It's not going to be fair to some people. It will be to others, but that's the kind of situation you get when you're talked about in the conversations with Patrick Mahomes, being compared to all the greats, and really just proving and showing out there on the field that you can win games on your own. This is the biggest chance he has of proving it, and I'm going to be very excited and anticipating to see how it all plays out, who they get to kind of help him out a little bit, because the Bills just can't sit around and do nothing. So seeing how they address that, seeing how Josh Allen reacts to it and how he plays off of it, it's all going to be great to watch. Just to add more to the NFL season, more storylines, more anticipation. It's all going to be great. It's all going to be a huge part of the NFL draft, which is just 3 weeks away from today. So more on that will come over the next few weeks on this show. But on that, I will close out this segment, and that's all the time I will have on this show. Again, I want to say a big thank you to you guys for tuning in and reminding you guys to please like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Make sure to also follow the network on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok for more content outside of the sports world as well. If you want to see more of me and the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, check out the YouTube channels, the GSMC Sports Network channel, and the Podcast Network channel for YouTube shorts that are posted on there daily, full live recorded videos, entire shows that are on there if you want to rewatch an entire show, as well as individual segment videos on each of the segments that make up the live show. If you missed one or want to go back and watch a specific one, they're all on there on both of those channels as well. Tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more of the episodes and more discussions and topics around the NFL with me, your host, Manny Maradiegue. Thanking you guys for joining me today and hoping you guys will join me all tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.